And so the purpose of this session is to hear back from each of the 5 different regions who had 2 discussion periods yesterday, discussion A and discussion B. And what we'd like to do is invite those regional leads and their teams to report back on some of the key themes and ideas they heard. So we have a limited time only with Alberta because one of their regional leads has to run off. So we're going to go with Alberta first and invite Adela Kincaid and Susan Mead-Kiss to present about a 10-minute recap of some of the things you heard yesterday in your regional session. Over to you.
Thank you, Amber. Great to see everyone on day 2. Everything's going so well. Congratulations. So I want to make sure the graphic recorder, Melissa, is available to show screens. That's fantastic. What I'm going to do is provide a bit of an overview on the Alberta regional discussion A and B, and Melissa joined our Alberta discussion and was able to capture a lot of information. So this is a graphic recording of our entire program A and B, and I'll just provide some quick notes, and then what we'll do is highlight the key themes that came out of those discussions. And then Adela, my co-lead and friend, will share some final thoughts as well as acknowledging our students. So for Alberta regional discussion, first of all, I want to acknowledge David Peacock and Catherine Pearl, David from University of Alberta and Catherine from MRU. They served as co-planners and they also helped with our presentation. So it was a very collaborative and co-creative process, and we're grateful for their time and their presentations and their colleagues' presentations. Our theme for Alberta, we were building off, of course, the national theme and the national discussion, but we focused on social change and identifying communities of learning from engagement with Indigenous communities in a reciprocal and co-creative manner. And so we, as I mentioned, had different presentations from the 3 different institutions that highlighted some really intriguing, exciting, and innovative work in this space. And we also included student perspectives and student learnings, and that I think really enriched our learning and our participants' learning. For session A, we had a presentation from Lisa Prinz from the University of Alberta and her colleague from their local radio station, and they focused on Humanities 101 and CJSR, the radio station, and access to learning, and some work that they have done in their local community with marginalized communities and working in the prison to take learning into the prison within an accessible form, radio. I mean, in the time of COVID, when lots of other technology or person-to-person wasn't available, radio was. We then heard from Dr. Catherine Pearl from Mount Royal University, and Catherine shared her work and her students' work engaging with community through civic innovation. And how they are navigating really that digital divide, the digital barriers that we've all experienced, and we've seen many marginalized communities, again, experienced. And they also demonstrate some of the work that they've done with Indigenous communities through that. And then our own Adela, Dr. Adela Kincaid, and her students shared their work in applied research projects in Indigenous studies, and one of the courses that Adela led and the students contributed to. And Adela and students shared their work with Indigenous elders, their work in Indigenous communities, and it was really a fantastic presentation. So thank you to our 3 presenters and their teams. We then broke into discussion groups, and we didn't have as much time as we would have liked. We had 2 student RAs and 2 student recorders assist with those discussion groups, where our participants just explored their own perspectives a little bit deeper. Our artist, Melissa, captured all of that activity for A, and then for session A, and then for session B, we had a smaller group. So we had about 30, 35 people attend session A, and for session B, about 15 attended. And our focus was really exploring the themes that emerged in a deeper way, and to shift the conversation from the why and the how, but really, the why and the what, but to really start focusing on the how. What were some tangible action items that we could explore, that we could each commit to in our personal and professional lives to support community engagement, to explore reciprocal co-creative ways of engaging through this pandemic and beyond. I do want to acknowledge that we reflected on Elder Lorna's blessing from the early morning session, or the earlier morning session, our national session, and each of our presenters acknowledged the land that we are situated on and shared comments and reflections regarding the meaning of Indigenous engagement and working with communities in a good way. So now, if I may ask, Melissa, can you shift to the slide or the image that shows the themes that we shared with you last night? So Adela and I, as well as David and Catherine in our session B, talked, we sort of refined some of the themes that we'd heard, and these are the ones that floated to the top. Melissa, are you comfortable speaking to the work that you've put together for us?
Yeah, sure. I'm just also going to do a land acknowledgement. I haven't done that, had the opportunity to do that. I practiced my trade on the traditional Coast Salish territories, the Stalo First Nations, and I too want to just acknowledge the privilege that I have being on these lands and the opportunity to listen and learn from everybody in this space, and in context of the direction and that we're doing. I just thought it would be appropriate to share that before I start. So thank you for inviting me into this space and allowing me to be witness to all of the amazing things that are happening in context of collaborative co-learning environment that you have happening in Alberta. And as Susan had mentioned, following the rich discussion, her and her colleagues went back and pulled out 7 high-level themes that that really stood out in the conversation, and I'm just going to go over those. So first off, one of the main things that came up is that indeed power imbalances exist. The cliche, we are not all in this together, or we are all in this together, it does not stand true for everybody. And it's important that we recognize this reality, especially when it comes to technology, that there are marginalized individuals that don't have access to the privilege of technology. And as a result, when it comes to doing good work, it's important that we keep that in mind. Another theme that emerged was around community campus engagement and the capacity. There's a need when working with communities to just consider the fact that every community and organization has its own capacity, and it's important to ask communities and organizations what they need and listen. So consider and honor their capacity and what they're able to do with the resources that they have and the direction that they want to go in. Sorry, I just thought there was something else on here. Just another thing that kind of emerged from that as well was just being able to just leverage the resources that each campus has in order to support those communities. Another key theme was accessibility and breaking through the digital desert. I spoke to this a little bit earlier when I spoke to the fact that we don't all experience the privilege in the same regard. There was also conversation about the benefits of remote learning. So from global projects, conferences, increased participation, not needing to travel, there's efficiencies and affordabilities. And naturally there's some drawbacks from remote learning, and it doesn't necessarily apply in all contexts. Creative funding, reducing administrative red tape, that's also kind of a directive that came out of the conversation. There's a need to be creative when it comes to finding ways to fund and support the projects that are happening in communities, and to also look for ways to reduce the bureaucratic setbacks that prohibit people from moving things forward. co-learning and reciprocity. This comes largely out of leaning into Indigenous ways of knowing and just the benefit of co-creating knowledge together and the empowerment that comes through it. And finally, one really interesting piece of conversation that came up that has relevance to this pandemic and a campus environment is the fact that there are students that are coming into university setting that have been living in the pandemic in their grade 12 and grade 11 year. And naturally, there's going to be a skill and knowledge gap. And then there's also students that, you know, in addition to graduating and the anxieties that come from the great unknown of their next steps, they've got a pandemic in their past and maybe a little bit in their future. And a student shared that some of her friends are taking what they call panic pandemic masters. So the directive that came out of that is just being aware and helping students navigate these challenges, whether they're incoming students or outgoing graduates. And that summarizes the high-level discussion that happened, the themes that emerged from the Alberta regional discussion.
Thank you, Melissa. You did such a beautiful job. Thank you for your deep listening skills and your reflection. You've really captured it and illustrated it so well. It was a joy to work with you. So I want to ask my colleague Adela to wrap up and also acknowledge some of the student work that we were so blessed to be able to enjoy.
Thank you very much, Susan, and thank you, Melissa. Good morning, or it's morning for where I am. I'm located on the unceded territory of the Sinixt, the Syilx, the Ktunaxa, and the Secwepemc peoples. And I know we only have a minute or so left, but I think it's important to hear a little bit from the students as well. And I'd just like to build on the theme of helping students navigate the challenges. And I know that we all had a discussion about what the difficulties are of students coming into post-secondary and students who are also leaving post-secondary and looking for opportunities once they've finished their studies or continuing on into graduate studies. And some of what was shared by the students, and I'll let them speak in a minute, but students in my classes and the students that are working with us is that some students are applying for to do graduate level work, whether that's their passion or not at this point, because they feel that there aren't a lot of opportunities for them otherwise. And then on the flip side, I've also heard from a lot of colleagues that there aren't as many students applying for graduate level work because they're so tired of learning online. So Saskia, if I could invite you, Saskia shared the term with us, the panic pandemic masters, yesterday. So Saskia, if you could just explain that for us in a sentence or so, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, so as I said yesterday, a lot of my friends and I are looking at potentially doing masters. And some of us have wanted to do masters for a while now. So for some people it is, their path, but for a lot of people I know, I don't think it's out of a want to actually do a master's degree. I think it's more of a panic of the job market or not being able to find a job for a year, or just being a student right now is hard, and graduating into really uncertain times is hard. So, I mean, more people going to grad school, it might be good. I don't know. It might just mean more people with master's degrees who, again, are graduating in a couple years and maybe still won't be able to find jobs. So I guess we'll see.
Thanks very much, Saskia. So I think that gives us a lot to think about, whether we are in teaching roles or working with or for NGOs and what those opportunities might look like. Matt, Jasleen, if you're with us, would you like to say a few words as well?
Sure, yeah, thank you, Adela. So I worked with Adela. I want to talk kind of about the course we worked on together because it was very much community campus based. And I thought it was a really cool opportunity as a student because I was able to be exposed to community organizations that I could potentially pursue careers with or work with in the future. So as a student, I don't think you get that much exposure to opportunities outside of academic institutions. So I think this conference and this idea of community campus partnerships is very valuable in that sense that for students, we're able to get that exposure. So that's just my perspective.
Thanks very much, Jasleen and Saskia. And back to you, Susan.
Just a final thank you to all of our colleagues. It was a really collaborative, co-creative process, and to all our participants, many of which are, or many of who are on this workshop today. Thank you all for your dialogue and for sharing your gifts and your learning with us. Thank you, Amber.
Thank you very much, Susan, Adela, Jasleen, and Saskia. Really appreciate the report back. And we will be seeing more of Melissa's beautiful illustrations in the next session after this as well. All right, so now I'd like to invite our colleagues from British Columbia to report back for approximately 10 minutes, if you will. And I believe that's Joanna.
Yes. Hi, Amber. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I suppose it's good afternoon for some of you as well. Yes, so my name is Joanna Habdank. I am a program manager at Simon Fraser University's Community Engaged Research Initiative. And today I'm coming to you from Vancouver, from the stolen ancestral lands of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. And I'm actually speaking today on behalf of Johol, who is series co-director and who's not able to join us today. Before I delve a little bit deeper into our discussions that took place yesterday, I want to very warmly acknowledge the help of our research assistant, Brianne McCormick. Brianne, thank you for hosting both of our sessions. It was really helpful to have your presence in both of them. So the two conversations that took place yesterday were organized by the CIRI team and were moderated by two of our team members, CIRI co-director Stuart Points and Jackie Wong, CIRI's Community Strategic Initiatives Associate. And there were four key themes that really emerged from the discussion yesterday, and it's been really interesting to see how often these themes have been coming up in the conversations today. So those themes are valuing community knowledge and wisdom, deconstructing patterns of institutional operations and barriers for community engaged research, nurturing long-lasting relationships, and cultivating a practice of care. So I'll go more in depth about each theme as I proceed with the discussions. So I'm just going to share my screen with you. And I'll come back up here. So the first regional conversation was titled Community Engaged Research in Times of Crisis, a continuing conversation. And it was centered on topics that were raised in an event that CIRI held in late March, titled Field Stories, Certain Times of Crisis. Field Stories was actually a symposium, a day-long symposium that explored a range of community-engaged research practices, stories, and assemblies that were focused on current social movements, the health crisis, and change in general. And the centering part of it was a focus on 4 different projects that were collaborations between universities and community partners using different forms of media. And so in the conversation yesterday, we had 3 out of the 4 leads from that symposium. And I'm not going to go too much in depth in terms of the background of the symposium itself, but I do want to share a link. I will share a link to the symposium afterwards so you can have a sense of some of the richness of the conversations that took place at that event. But what really came out of this conversation in BC yesterday, the conversation really was centered on a couple of questions that arose, which were, what are the blind spots of universities, and what more can be done by universities to engage with communities in more impactful ways? So 3 themes really centered and grounded these conversations, and I'll just share some quotes that came out of those conversations and some reflections. So the first theme that we looked at was valuing community knowledge and wisdom. And here I shared a couple of quotes from Cixi Fu, which I think really speak very clearly and directly to that point. When you look at shifting the ways in which we engage with that which is given. So how do we hold knowledge? How do we hold wisdom? How do we value this? How do we work in equity with our communities? The other thing that really emerged in this conversation was the idea that we need to leave our jobs really, our degrees, our hats, our administrative hats, our researcher hats, whatever we carry around, and really come to the table as human beings, and having those relational relationships and partnerships, really looking at who we are as people, rather than trying to continuously maneuver in these structures and within these institutions. The next theme really looked at deconstructing patterns of operations and barriers of community engaged research. And here I shared a couple of quotes from Sharon Carnston, as well as a community researcher, Sam Farney. And when you look at Sharon's quote, you see that also directly leads to the previous theme. And I think that's part of the conversation that we've also had, which is that so much of these conversations and themes are really interrelated, interconnected quite deeply. And it's really difficult to pull any of them apart, and really, nor should we, I think. And here I just use, provide some examples of the types of structures that were mentioned, which is, looking at short forms, asking for bias from participants, looking at what is institutionally valuable, extracting information from participants. That's been a really big conversation piece, at least at CIRI, and really looking at how do we sort of reframe, change, and break down some of these structures that can be really quite, that can really raise the barriers quite high when we're considering working in equity with community. Lastly, the third theme that really centered these conversations was nurturing long-lasting relationships. As we all know, we can't have these partnerships, whether it's within institutions, whether it's community, without trust. And trust comes with time. And so we really need to have a long lens when we're looking at building community relationships. And I'm just also putting in a couple of questions here that came up during the conversations. One of which I also really wanted to stress here is how to create a safe enough environment for vulnerable voices to be heard. I think that's something that is so vital to the work that we want to engage with, that we are engaging with. But as we've seen, so many people have been disenfranchised by this pandemic, have really felt the impact so very deeply. And I think that should be really at the forefront of the conversation as well. And so moving on to the second session that we held, we called it the Remaking the Table, Regional Approaches to Community Engaged Research, a CIRI case study. And this is actually part of a monthly webinar series that we've been holding here at CIRI since November, and it explores strategies and solutions for a more equitable, inclusive approach to community engaged research. And more information and the webinars themselves can be found on our website, which I can share a little bit later on. This conversation really, the participants in this conversation were Jasmine Verk and Aman Chandi Aman is actually a SFU graduate student, and together with Jasmine, they have been documenting a story of community garden plot in Newton in the city of Surrey in BC. And throughout this process, Aman has also been conducting community engaged research. For those of you who are not familiar with BC and Vancouver, Surrey is quite a large city, not too far from Vancouver. It's been, one of our campuses is actually also located there. The other speaker that we had during that session was Alicia Massey, and she conducted a map of community engaged research projects in Surrey, trying to understand how those projects might be related to each other, how people come together, and finding that it's actually one of the things that has been difficult is to find those connections, even within the institution itself, or maybe especially during an institution sometimes as large as universities. And so the two areas of focus that really centered this conversation were cultivating care practice and reflections on the formal institutional processes. And both of these are also linked to the conversation that we had in the previous session. So I really won't speak too deeply on these topics. I think they're really something that most of us have been aware of, that have been touched by, that are experiencing ourselves. But I do want to stress that really what was very, very clear is that there is a significant burnt out being felt by communities, by researchers, and within institutions, by students, especially by students. And so I'm just going to leave you with some of the quotes that came out of that conversation and some questions. I think it's really one of the things that was really interesting too is what Aman said about one of the things that people really need to do is to, or are really seeking right now, is just the chance to be seen and a chance to be valued. And so I think when we're talking about community relationships with institutions, when we're talking about just our own relationships, is how do we see each other, how do we value each other, how do we express that? So looking ahead, how do we make that part of our systems, part of our relationships, and how do we also incorporate that culture of care within, for ourselves, for our friendships, our relationships, and for the community members that we are working together with or hope to. And lastly, just a few more questions and comments that I'm going to share with you that emerged from that conversation on the theme of reflections on the formal institutional processes, which really is also linked back to one of the conversations, or a few of the conversations that were happening in session A around institutional barriers. I won't delve too deeply into this because I think we're all very keenly aware of this, but I do want to leave with one note, which is there is a sense that if we really want to see change, we need to think about what that means, and it may be that we're looking towards having radical change and having some serious reflections on how to do better and how to be better. And that's it from BC.
Thank you very much, Joanna, for the presentation and for the themes from BC. And now I would like to move to our colleagues in Ontario. So Peter and Ashley, you could take approximately 10 minutes to present some summary themes from your session. Thank you.
Sorry, I guess it's helpful if I unmute myself instead of talking to to the room. I'm just going to share the screen here to get started. You could just let me know if that's working. Perfect. Thank you, Amber. So I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin people, otherwise known as the City of Ottawa.
And I'm going to provide a high-level summary of yesterday's 2 regional sessions for Ontario and some of the themes that I believe emerged throughout. I think it's important to note that our sessions were built on 2 separate structures. The first was being a panel of 6 individuals invited to help contextualize the moment we are living in Ontario today, the 3rd wave. And the second being a facilitated conversation building on those, what the panel shared. So in terms of the panel, we had a wide range of community-based perspectives, and I'll just provide a short summary of each one. I unplugged my mic. So the first being Charmaine Magumby from Peterborough, Nova Jimonon, and she spoke about the history of institutions exclusion in Peterborough, the transformation that continues to take shape in that community, and how this transformation is shaping campus community partnerships. Natasha Akawenzi from Boggamwad Alliance shared their ongoing partnership projects centered on 7 generational teachings and adapting to the new world of Zoom. Chris Ramsarup from Justika for Migrant Workers helped to name the moment of racism and colonialism that continues to shape food justice. I think it was important that he noted those who often grow the food in Ontario are unable to access it throughout the pandemic. Rochelle from the Guelph Community Health Center shared how COVID-19 has been a test of the system, noting that leadership and system responses are easy to manage on sunny days, but the true test comes in the moment of crisis. Nicole Austin helped us to articulate the Black food sovereignty movement in Canada and the opportunities for urban farming that has emerged through a partnership with Ryerson University. While the pandemic illustrates gaps in the system, Nicole also demonstrated how there's transformative action occurring in our communities if we look for it. And finally, Adriana Bremen drew our attention to the precarious work that too often defines our local economies. Essential workers who continue to experience challenges of housing, fairly wage jobs, consistent employment, inequitable access to sick leave, and other system-wide effects that hold serious consequences post-pandemic. One of the critical lessons from this moment must be that our work should center those in the margins in our analysis, thinking about those who are most affected by this moment. So these are the lessons that our panelists all brought to us, and they continued throughout the breakout rooms. And I think these breakout rooms and the panel discussions are best identified in some themes. The first being naming this moment. The objective of the panel was to name the moment, and for participants in the 2 conversations, this meant reflection on the exclusion of Black and Brown individuals in Ontario that is both historic and current to our times. It also means recognizing the structures that create inequitable systems of food, health, post-secondary education, community well-being are there, and recognizing that to achieve something like food sovereignty, we must address the inequalities reproduced through racist, colonial, gendered, and other oppressive practices. But it also means articulating hope, identifying not how we give communities hope, but recognizing that hope exists, and opportunities to connect through joy and fun can be equally important. Adapting means at times changing the tools that we use. Boggamwad Alliance turned to Zoom as an opportunity to connect beyond regional boundaries, creating new friendships and future partners. In the case of Justika, adapting meant new tools to connect with migrant workers when physical space became inaccessible. WhatsApp, Facebook Messenger, and spaces that were meant to ensure access to food for migrant workers also became space for organizing. By naming this moment, we also recognize the opportunities for community and solidarity. As one of the breakout sessions discussed, setting the table means recognizing the knowledge the community brings and part of the partnership we are developing, and including tangible goals that fit the needs of the community. As another group noted, we also need to be mindful of how we view these spaces. Students occupy space in the university, but often see themselves as part of the community. Similarly, this discussion kept coming back to the theme of time and authentic relationships that we are building with each other. Community campus partnerships require investment in the community, building trust with each other, and recognizing the value of that partnership. This work is important, but it should also address urgent gaps when necessary, while remaining focused on the root causes of inequitable institutions and systems. We need to be mindful of institutions that reproduce barriers in inequitable spaces, and remembering that power dynamics between large institutions and small organizations will continue to be present. So when we're thinking through campus community initiatives, we need to be asking, what is the research and whose interests are here? Who speaks for whom? And these expectations should be clear. Setting the table means that sometimes we meet the community in the community, and we don't expect community to approach the institutions of post-secondary. As Natasha reminded us, to form partnerships with her community it is important to meet on the land, exchange knowledge, and to know your neighbors. We should also be thinking about the table that we have built, what voices are missing. And this includes developing knowledge mobilization events where you can access new voices for decision-making, planning, and funding processes that are integrated to whatever project we're developing. It also means recognizing this work should be transformational. Building programs with reduced barriers is not enough for our communities. There are successful stories emerging in this pandemic, including Just Recovery Hamilton, that has built a coalition with the objective of setting a large table for this moment. The last lesson was resilience of communities. This theme is recognizing relationships are formed through time, authenticity, and honesty, and they're critical to our work collectively moving forward. It's recognizing that institutions and communities we occupy are not monolithic. They're diverse, and the diversity within these institutions and community spaces helps to identify successful strategies, the good work occurring, important knowledge, and the resiliency that already exists. I think this is best summed up by Rochelle, who spoke about the intention required to build resiliency. And perhaps this led us all to one final question. How can we move forward with the intention in these conversations towards the next crisis? And then I just wanted to end on a short note of thanks to those who contributed. It takes a lot of labor to develop the vision for these events, the logistics required to put it together, and the relationships that have to be built quickly to ensure it works well. So thank you to everyone who contributed their time and knowledge and skills to the Ontario sessions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley and Peter, for your themes and beautiful slides as well. Now I'd like to move to the Atlantic region. So Mary and Mike.
Thank you. I'm going to start it off by asking Kayla Mansfield, who co-hosted the session with me, to start.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. Kwe, hello. My name is Kayla Mansfield Brown. My Mi'kmaq name is Dancing Deer, and along with Dr. Mary Sweetman of Acadia University, we had the pleasure to co-host the Atlantic Breakout Sessions yesterday. I would like to start our presentation by acknowledging that our institution and works resides within Mi'kma'ki, the unceded land of the First Peoples, who are the Mi'kmaq, Malamisi, and Passamaquoddy nations. This territory is protected by the treaties of peace and friendship signed between 1725 and 1752 with the British Crown. Mi'kma'ki includes Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, Newfoundland, and the Gaspé area of Quebec. Unfortunately, treaties were not upheld for the First Peoples, and they were forced to separate from their lands and moved into reserve lands. There are 13 communities across Nova Scotia, which make up only 0.02 of the entire landmass. Colonial governments continue to breach treaty relations and responsibilities over the past 400 years, not including to the vast populations of urban and off-reserve non-status populations. We are all treaty people on this land and across the territories for which we work, live, play. And we all have a responsibility and accountability in upholding the natural laws and understanding of our rights and responsibilities. Land acknowledgements are not just something that we say in the meetings in which we attend, but it's more towards the actions and the things that we do. As land-based peoples, ensuring sustainable partnerships is vital in our sovereignty and in decolonizing and eliminating the barriers created by white supremacy. I want you to think about the word of Jalasi. It is a Mi'kmaq term that was used by community leaders and chiefs during sacred events, meaning come in and take your place. What is your place in being a treaty person across Indigenous territories? And how are our sustainable practices being upheld in institutions and organizations? In thinking about reconciliation and moving forward in meaningful ways, we can look to the teachings of Elder Albert Marshall with two-eyed seeing. The Mi'kmaq word for this is Edawuktamunk, and it means the gift of multiple perspectives, ensuring that Indigenous worldviews are equally recognized of those in colonial society. As we moved through the sessions, the gift of these multiple perspectives proved to be a reminder of the steps that we've made and the journey forward. I would like to now pass it along to Mary.
Thank you, Kayla. This was a real honor and joy to share this co-hosting with Kayla, as well as with an amazing team of people who came together around the Atlantic provinces to share their stories. And so I just want to give sort of a high level of what we did in those two sessions, and then talk about what we found. And I just, first of all, just wanted to say thank you to the other regions, what amazing outcomes and outputs that you've just shared with us. So thank you. So our two sessions, we shared over 14 stories in two panels and by story hosts who hosted breakout sessions. Altogether, over the two sessions, we had about 45 minutes of breakout room discussions where participants could talk. In session one, we had about 40 participants engaging in some way, and in the second one, about 30. And so what we decided to do was capture this with two amazing graphic recorders who followed us along on those two sessions. So Kayla and I, and Alicia, if she is willing, who's here too, I think, who's one of our graphic recorders, will speak to those. But I just wanted to quickly introduce some of the folks that shared their stories with us as a way to get us engaged in discussion. So these folks that you see right now on the screen helped us out with the first session and covered topics from the Tantramar COVID-19 task that came together because of COVID. And it was explained to us as a love story of reciprocity within a community in New Brunswick. We had Sasha DeWolf talking about Indigenous education and collaboration between the University of New Brunswick and the University of Mount Allison. We had Justin Afio, who talked about the challenges and opportunities with farmers markets of Nova Scotia. We had Kelly and Amy, Kelly Vondon and Amy Hudson, who came from Newfoundland and Labrador to talk to us about water issues and access to clean drinking water, particularly in Labrador. And then we had Fakayo Coyote, who talked about a grassroots student movement from Wolfville, Nova Scotia around Black Lives Matter and the Black Student Association, of which she was the president. And then we had Will Roy, who talked to us about the project coordinator, who is the project coordinator of People, Places, Policies and Perspectives around affordable housing in Cape Breton. Next, in our second session, we focused more on institutions and organizations that had some guiding principles and practices for engagement. So we had amazing speakers talk about Coady International Institute. That was Corinne Cash. Brady Reed talked about Fee Lab from the Atlantic Hub perspective. Laurie Brickton from PEI talked about island studies. And then we had two people talk about the interesting intersects of one talking about being a faculty within an institution and one talking about being an executive director of a nonprofit organization and how they work collaboratively together around reciprocity and co-creation. So that's sort of, high level of what we did in those panels. And then we had these breakout sessions that were hosted by, again, people who were willing to share their stories. So some of the representatives there were some amazing people from Common Good Solutions. We had Clary represented by Ray McNeil. We had Emily Duffett, who is talking about work integrated learning. Rachel Sparling talking about Access Acadia, which is around inclusive post-secondary options for people who identify with intellectual disabilities. And Dr. Philip Roy, who was talking about wellness, specifically around eating disorders and the LGBTQ+ communities. So a big shout out to Janine and Alicia, who put together our graphic recordings. around this. And so Kayla and I will now spend a little bit of time talking about this. I'll ask Alicia to step in as well if she wants to add a few things. But this kind of captures what we discovered. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, and I'll let you kind of enjoy the diagram or the picture that you see in front of you. But I'd like to draw your attention to the signpost. And this signpost really shows the dramatic tension between the challenges and opportunities that were presented to our community organizations and partnerships this past year. These also showed up as tensions between performative allyship versus authentic collaboration, apathy versus empathy, individualism versus collectivism, siloed work, competing for resources versus relationship-driven, bureaucratic red tape that only insiders understand versus flexibility and adaptability within community university partnerships. Lack of access, particularly if you can see the top corner around internet inequality, housing crisis, access to clean water versus asset-based community development approaches. And finally, the amplification of colonial systems during this past year versus a heightened focus and interest in reconciliation within our institutions. So I might just pass it over to Alicia if you wanted to say a few things about what, or add some notes there, if you'd like, on your graphic.
Sure, thanks, Mary, and thanks for that beautiful description. It's really nice to create something and then see how someone takes it in. So that was really beautiful. So thanks for that. Yeah, for context for folks listening, in front of you, like Mary spoke, there is that dramatic difference there, but you might also notice this tiny little path near the bottom of the screen. And so Janine isn't able to be here today, but it was very fun to work with Janine in this capacity where we both have very different styles in catching and how we might design something. So it was really fun to work together. And the idea that you'll see between both this one and her harvest as well is that there's a path here in the Atlantic region, and we're leading to a look off of what we're looking to coming forward and through this transition of recognizing what we experience going through challenges, restrictions, and barriers that will likely still move with us, but how might we approach them as we go on this path together. But yeah, this is just a capture of really prominent quotes and things that were shared by the folks on the call yesterday, and all of their knowledge is really beautiful to take in. So that's probably all I have to add, Mary. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Alicia. Yeah, and so just what Alicia was talking about. So this is the second sort of frame that we came up with, and I'll pass it over to Kayla.
Yes, so here in graphic 2, we can kind of see the typical representation of the Atlantic coast and the themes along with the scenery and the lighthouse and the boat. So let's take a look at the lighthouse. So in this lighthouse, it shows the guiding principles, practices, and ideas that as community partners and organizations that we're using, such as embracing our opportunities for learning and growth, accessibility, and transparency. As the light shows up, we can see the boat and sails that represent the way in which we continue to move forward, such as ensuring equitable representation, recognizing our points of privilege, and working from the ground up. The waves signify that there will be challenges along the way, including fears and apprehensions in holding systems and ourselves accountable in meaningful change. The sunset that's behind the boat is where we want to go, meeting communities where they're at, and the mobilization of services and ensuring equitable access to all things, including communications and technology. The clouds represent the questions we still have up in the air. How do we shift our priorities as organizations and institutions? And as they shift, how do we properly deal with this learning and unlearning? The intersectional content and conversations that took place yesterday are a great reminder to the work that we must continue to do in ensuring just and sustainable community partnerships for the next 7 generations. Before we wrap up, I'd like to extend and express a thank you for our invitation and participation in this work, and to all those that were involved in the process for the Atlantic sessions, including our note takers, graphic illustrators, participants, and speakers. In Mi'kmaq, we use the word Walaliok. That means thank you all.
Thank you so much to the Atlantic region and everyone involved with the beautiful illustrations. It's wonderful to see. Thank you so much for your hard work. All right, now with our last few minutes, we would like to report back from Saskatchewan and Manitoba. So I'm going to, at this point, share my screen and turn things over to my colleague, Lynn Gidluck, who will begin with presenting some of our themes, and then you'll hear from myself and also from Steph Bernier, our research assistant as well. So Lynn, over to you, and I'll pull up our slides.
Well, thank you, everyone. That's a hard act to follow. Wow, what amazing presentations. And I just would like to kind of emphasize that as much as possible of what was happened in the other regions will be posted eventually to the Community Campus Engage Canada website, because I'm sure you're like me and thinking, oh, wow, that's so amazing. I wish I could have been in that room when you were all having these amazing conversations. And I was certainly feeling the same way as I was during our first regional conversation. We had the very great privilege of hearing the stories of work done throughout the pandemic by 3 incredibly inspiring people and the organizations and institutions that they lead. And I couldn't help but think that I wished the entire group of people that as part of this conference, this workshop these past few days had been able to listen in. So you will have that opportunity through the CCEC website to learn a little bit more about this. But we heard from Colleen Christopherson-Cote, who is coordinator of, she ended up serving as the incident command for the Saskatoon interagency response to COVID-19. And her story made me very proud to be from Saskatchewan. I think this is going to be one of these case studies where communities across the country can look at what was done during in Saskatoon to come together to help the most vulnerable, most marginalized people in the city of Saskatoon, to come together to respond so quickly to the issues that emerged because of the pandemic. And one of the things I found most fascinating about Colleen's comments was about how her entire life she spent as a collaborative leader, right? But in a situation like this, it really needed to have somebody come to the top and be in command that would be able to make those decisions really quickly. And the point that she made, which has been coming up so often in all of the presentations, is about, like, in order to work together and the collaboration, is that importance of trust being built. The only reason that worked was because the individual put in this position didn't have those kind of the power dynamics, the issues of one organization trumping another. She had established trust through in so many months and years prior to this happening. And so there's going to be a lot of lessons that you'll be able to learn, I think, from about the Saskatoon response. And we also had the opportunity to hear from Kristen Nelson, who is the director of Saskatchewan 211. And that is one of the really good news stories that came out of this pandemic. We, in the sense that there was national funding to expand the 211 system across Canada. And Kristen was able to share just how they were able to work so closely with the team in Saskatoon and getting that data available so that people could call or text or check on a website to find out, that things were changing daily during the, especially during different points in the pandemic, and just that work that happened there. And we had a chance to also listen to Bonnie Jeffrey, who is a social work professor from the University of Regina, but based in Prince Albert, who spent most of her lifetime doing work with rural and northern communities, and really talking about how those the realities of what research, how that looks like during a pandemic period when you're not able to be in direct contact with the people that you're working with, and especially as someone like Bonnie, who is very much spent her lifetime, everything's community driven, and how that reality of working virtually, there's a lot of, I think, lessons that can be learned about their project with dementia in rural Saskatchewan, and research around rural adults that we can all learn in terms of best practices of both the barriers that are resulted, but some of the creative ways that they worked around some of that. Take it away, Amber, to talk about our session B.
Thank you, Lynn. Yes, so certainly one of the themes that came out from both session A and session B was this theme of we're not all in this together. And this is something that we've heard from several of the other groups as well. Some of the key issues highlighted included increases to violence, intimate partner violence, for example, that have occurred during the pandemic, access to things like public washrooms, so very basic needs, transportation, for example, needs that are not being fulfilled because of the pandemic, and how organizations quickly pivoted, that's a word we're hearing a lot, pivoted to respond to those needs. Certainly the importance of listening to lived experience was something that came up repeatedly throughout our conversation, especially in discussion session B. We heard about the importance of the coordinating roles that are housed within universities and the need for those sort of formal structures that help to facilitate community campus engagement, without which things become less formalized, more individualized. The onus gets put on individuals and work becomes pro bono, as one of our participants called it. And unfortunately, without those sort of formal supportive structures from universities, this kind of work does have the potential to fall apart. It's fragile. It may not be sustainable. So we discussed the importance of universities really stepping up to support community campus engagement efforts, when unfortunately during COVID, we have actually seen the opposite, and that is cuts to those supportive infrastructures that do exist in some places. And really there was a lot of emphasis again on trust, on relationship building, and how community campus engagement offices and coordinators can play a role in that, but that also it exists within the individual collaborations themselves. There was a lot of discussion in session B on some of these specific opportunities for community campus partnership that exist here in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba. We spoke about the importance of projects that focus on preserving the knowledge of traditional medicines, land-based medicines that for whom that Indigenous communities know so much about, and how that knowledge can be preserved, documented, and kept. We heard about the role of specific methods, participatory methods like photo voice and participatory video, and how much of a role they can play in helping and supporting communities to share their stories and their experiences and to centralize their voices in the discussion. The importance of elders' knowledge, which is being increasingly integrated into universities through elders in residence programs, through elders colleges. The Lifelong Learning Center here at the university is one model of an elders college that focuses on both Indigenous and non-Indigenous elders and the knowledge that they hold, that very important knowledge that can and should be passed intergenerationally, and how community campus engagement has the power to facilitate this kind of important sharing. And those are the themes in a nutshell. What I would like to do next with just the last couple minutes that we have is to turn it over to Steph Bernier. Steph is a research assistant who has really been helping the work of the Saskatchewan and Manitoba Regional Group. She is a student of philosophy, politics, and economics at the University of Regina. And I'd like to just give her the opportunity to add some final words from our region. So Steph, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Amber. Yeah, I don't want to keep everybody too long. I just had a couple points to kind of finish off our discussion of Saskatchewan and Manitoba. Before I start, I did just want to quickly say I am speaking from Regina, so I'm on Treaty 4 territory right now. And I just had 3 main points that I wanted to kind of add to finish off this recap. One of those being, I know in our second discussion, we talked a lot about how community organizations, sometimes it can be hard for them to know where to go to kind of start collaborative projects. A lot of times these relationships are they can be fragile, so they're kind of built on just, 1 or 2 people knowing each other. So sometimes it can be hard for them to know where to go to kind of start those collaborations. Another point that I believe Lynn made in our discussion B session as well is that putting pressure on universities can be really important to kind of get funding and also just get these collaborative projects off the ground. University leaders, deans, as an example, can have a really big impact on how universities collaborate with people. So really putting pressure on them and letting them know how important these projects are to people is really, really key. And then I just kind of wanted to finish with just giving a shout out to Lynn as well and the CERC. We had multiple people mention how valuable workshops and things like that they run are, and just that they really help out the community and they really help collaboration. So Lynn, give yourself a big pat on the back. But yeah, those projects are really, really invaluable, and just keeping that up is really important for our community partners. So I don't want to keep everyone too long. That was kind of my little add-on there. But yeah, thank you, Amber and Lynn, for kind of leading that there.
Well, thank you so much, Steph. And we're only a few minutes over, which isn't so bad. Apologies for keeping everyone late. Our next item on the agenda is a break, and we now have a 1-hour break, so coming back at 2:15 Eastern Time. However, I would like to encourage everyone to leave their audio on, and maybe even you'll want to stay in your seat and watch, because we have a break performance from the very talented singer, songwriter, pianist, Jeffrey Straker. I would like to, if I could, just spend 1 moment sharing a bio of our very talented artists. Jeff Straker, singer-songwriter, pianist Jeffrey Straker grew up taking piano lessons in small-town Saskatchewan. He actually swears he was born under the piano on the family farm, and since those grand beginnings, good pun, has gone on to perform over 100 shows per year across Canada, Europe, and Latin America. The storytelling nature of his roots folk songs has the power to transport a listener out onto a lake in Canada's north or to the main street of a prairie town. A clever lyricist with an energetic piano style, his songwriting has drawn critical